Today on Young Heretics, I would like to nominate myself, Spencer Klavan, for King of the United States. No, I don't actually want to do that, although I hope I would have your vote for king. But I do want to talk about kings and kingship. This is going to be a two-part episode. This is part one, and then part two will come next week. This is a hugely important element of political philosophy. It is becoming troublesomely relevant right now because for a whole host of reasons, but one reason that's emerged on this show is as we talk about some of the developments that are going on, this sense of kind of social collapse, the decay from democracy into mob rule. A lot of what's going on sort of looks to me a little bit as if we could be in line for some kind of really scary government transition or some strong man to kind of get us, to clear the field. This is when I did the episode on Rome in the 130s BC. We talked about the Gracchi, and we talked about the fact that when you have these mass movements of popular unrest, all of this kind of this dead elite that's not doing anything, you leave the field wide open for people who can come in. I'm not advocating it hardly at all, in fact, at all, but I am saying that you leave the field wide open for somebody to make use of all that popular energy and basically rally the whole community behind himself. And so it's come up a lot. And another thing that's come up is that the experience of monarchy is not always bad for every people, right? And that's something that it's very hard to talk about in an American context because we all, myself included, have a story about America that begins with the expulsion of a king, with the, removal of King George from power over the Americas. And it's like the Romans, as we'll get into, we emerged from that experience with a deep and I think fully warranted mistrust of kings and of any one fallible human being accruing too much power to himself. I will now pause and bring you a word from our sponsors. So this show exists to bring you ancient culture and Western culture more generally, and to really make that yours, right? Because it is yours. It's your heritage. It belongs to you. Anybody who is in the West can take ownership of this stuff and it will enrich you tremendously. However, one of the things that sometimes gets in the way is language, right? We don't all speak Greek and Latin, but they are crucially important. The language barrier is one of the barriers that we want to break down here. And so if you feel daunted by that, if you feel like you want to read these texts in the original, but you don't know where to start, Ancient Language Institute is for you. They do this in a way that is very accessible. It's like learning a living language. So you, instead of memorizing long lists of verbs or vocabulary, you actually speak and read from day one as if you were learning a living language, and you get a real feel for the nuances of it. If you want to try this out, and I encourage you to do so, go to ancientlanguage.com/youngheretics, and you can enter the promo code heretics to get 15% off. So that's just like in the title, HERETICS, heretics. ancientlanguage.com/youngheretics, enter heretics, and get 15% off. Okay, back to the show. I am, as wary as you are of examining whether there can be such a thing as good kingship. And yet, we've covered a lot of places. For example, Livy, which is going to be the main guy we talk about today. We've covered a lot of places in Livy where it sort of looks like kingship was good for the Romans for a time while they reached their political maturity. So today's episode is going to be about the good kings of Rome and the good things that they did. And then next week's episode will be about the decline of the Roman monarchy. And we're going to look in some considerable detail at book one of Livy's history in order just to answer this question, is that if it turns out that America is just at that point on the cycle of regimes where we're about to get swept over by an autocrat, would that be the end of the world? I'm eventually going to argue that yes, it would, and I'm going to argue that we're not locked into this destiny of being under a kingship. But it's something that's out there, and I just thought it would be good to talk about with the example of Rome, which is the closest one to us. We haven't really looked at the period of Roman kingship, which is before the Republic, quite yet. So let's launch into it. But first, let me just say thank you so much for being here. It's great as always. It's wonderful to be talking to you about this stuff. I could do it forever. Unfortunately, we do it only once a week. But if you have not yet, please subscribe. Hit the button wherever you are in Apple Podcasts and Google Play and Stitcher and whatever, and tell people about the show on Facebook, on Twitter, and then most importantly, the way to support this show, if you want to help us out, is to leave a 5-star review. Those have been crucial to the show's success so far. Besides which, I love reading them. They give me a really clear sense of what this show is giving for you. And it is for you, right? This is the classical education you never knew you were missing, is what this show is. And I really want to hear about your experience of it. It brings me great joy to read that. So please leave a 5-star review. I have been hearing, and I said this last week too, I have been hearing that some people can't ask mailbag questions because they're not on Twitter and they don't want to get on Twitter. And I completely understand this. And so for these few episodes, for the 4 weeks that we're currently, this is the second week of this offer, if you leave a 5-star review with a mailbag question in it, then at the end of those 4 weeks, I'm going to do a special episode in which I answer as many of your questions as I possibly can. We get a lot of questions answered, I think, in that time. And so if that's something that you're interested in, or if you just want to support the show, give us a 5-star review. Again, thanks so much for being here. It's really great that you're here. So, okay, let's remind ourselves. Let's start when we talked about Horatius Cocles. Let's remind ourselves of what we heard there from Livy about how the kings maybe helped Rome out, right? And Livy, this great historian of ancient Rome, he's from Padua. He writes in the Augustan period, which is the period under Augustus. So this is a very live question because they've just undergone exactly that transition where the Republic has kind of broken down, and they've now, after a period of tremendous civil unrest and violent bloodshed, they've now transitioned into what is effectively a monarchy, even though it's called an empire, and the guy is the imperator or the Caesar, right? Caesar Augustus is in power. And here's what he writes, but looking back, Livy writes in book 2 about what kingship did for Rome as it was getting started, as it was coming into being. He says, "It cannot be doubted that Brutus," and we'll get to Brutus, he's the guy not the guy that kills Julius Caesar, but the sort of namesake of that Brutus who kicks the kings out. "It cannot be doubted that Brutus, who made for himself so great a name by the expulsion of Tarquin, would have done his country the greatest disservice had he yielded too soon to his passion for liberty and forced the abdication of any of the previous kings. One has but to think of what the populace was like in those early days, a rabble of vagrants, mostly runaways and refugees, and to ask what would have happened if they had suddenly found themselves protected from all authority by inviolable sanctuary and enjoying complete freedom of action, if not full political rights. In such circumstances, unrestrained by the power of the throne, they would, no doubt, have set sail on the stormy sea of democratic politics, swayed by the gusts of popular eloquence and quarreling for power with the governing class of a city which did not even belong to them before any real sense of community had had time to grow." So let's think here about what he's saying was good about kingship for the Romans. So the first thing is that they came into being as a society, and we're going to get into this today. They came into being really as like a bunch of misfits. They were sort of a scraggly group of outlaws in many cases, and these mostly men, almost all men to begin with. And he's basically saying, if you just let those people loose on themselves and one another, the results would not be pretty. And it's this now familiar critique of pure democracy, that it eventually devolves into mob rule, and it with people that are not trained up in the ways of community and the ways of liberty. With those people, it immediately would dissolve into complete chaos. And so one of the things that makes us antsy now about America is that we worry that our populace is no longer fit to self-govern, right? We look at people rioting in the streets, we look at people crying over the smallest thing, over like Jordan Peterson's book being published, and we think, well, gosh, are these people really grown-ups? Are they really fit to do liberty? And even though we believe that all men by right should be free, that they're created free, we also know that practically speaking, liberty can be disastrous for people who have not been trained in how to use it. And so, this is this critique that Livy gives, and he says, before they had been trained up by the kings, the Romans would have done all the terrible things that that we, worry about democracies doing. But instead, they eventually developed this republican system, which we'll talk about, this tripartite system, which is much subtler and more carefully constructed to balance the different excesses of different people against each other. And we've covered other thinkers who have grappled with this. When we talked about Machiavelli, for instance, right, he said it was foolish to create or maintain a republic where the conditions of liberty, which are the traditions of free society, healthy relationships between social classes, all this stuff, where those conditions don't exist, even if republics are the best thing, it's foolish to create one where the conditions don't exist. And when we talked about Virgil, of course, we grappled with the fact that the greatest period of Rome's artistic flourishing, at least so far as we know, and a period of great social stability, at least for some people also, was under Augustus. And so Livy, of course, who's living under Augustus, is having exactly these thoughts. And in Suetonius, who's another historian, 1st, 2nd century AD, he writes a history, the Divus Augustus, divine Augustus, and he says that, he quotes Augustus, and he said, "I found Rome made of stone and left it made of marble." And so, of course, this is another advantage of kingship, that when you have a strong leader who gets to basically dictate, he can get things done. And people, you hear actually leftists often kind of making this complaint that the executive isn't strong enough, that, that we really should pack the courts because we need to be able to accomplish things in this constant gridlock, which of course is in fact built into our system by the founders. This gridlock is stopping us from enacting our social policies. And basically what I'm saying here is that, if you believe in liberty or death, then that kind of talk is anathema. But you also have to acknowledge that before, in the history of Rome, when you're talking basically about, one step up from tribal warfare, you're talking about these communities that are building, agrarian societies and warring with one another. Sometimes it's a matter of the purest expediency to have a leader who can lead those people into war, who can teach them how to behave around one another. All of this stuff, right, merits kingship in Livy's view. And the story that Livy tells about the kings basically bears that out. So that's why we're talking today about the good kings, right? We're talking about what good kingship looks like. And the argument that I'm going to be making, that is both the reason why Rome's kingship in this story is successful and why kingship always, in my view, falls apart, is because there is no substitute for virtue and for personal morality. The thing that sets, in a kingship, the knife edge that you balance between success and failure is basically the knife edge of the character of the individual in power, because there's no other checks, right? I mean, there are some in some cases, but really, you either have a good king or you have a bad king. It's why it falls apart, but it's also why if you have a good king, you can get a lot done and create a very flourishing society. Now, a note first of all about our source here, Livy, right? So I mentioned that he's born in Padua around 59 or 64 BC, and this is northern Italy. So he's not, born a Roman, but he lives under Augustus' reign. He's publishing throughout Augustus' reign and also after Augustus' death in 14 AD. So this is a huge, a monumental project, the histories. It ends up in 142 books, but only 35 of them are extant. So the only 35 of them still survive. And it covers the period from the founding of Rome all the way down to 9 BC. And he says at the outset that he's doing this in some sense to contemplate the Republican past and enjoy reflections on Republican virtue as a way of escaping the troubles of the present day, which tells you something already about, where his sympathies lie, where his yearnings lie, at least, when it comes to forms of government. But he's honest enough to concede that kingship was good for Rome in the outset. And, there's been arguments that, he's like everybody, he's kind of paying lip service to Augustus. He can't say too much. But first of all, he publishes after Augustus' death, for one thing, even though Rome remains an empire at that time. But also, he's always kind of a man apart. Livy is known to have it's not that he was hostile to or hated by high society in Rome, but he was not one of these guys like Virgil and Horace who hung out with Maecenas, who was like kind of Augustus' culture minister, right? And with Calpurnius Piso and these grandees, he was criticized really for being kind of a country bumpkin. And he's obviously enamored of this sort of spare agrarian virtue that he believes emerged during the period of kingship and then endured through the early republic. So here we go. Let's take a look at this first king of Rome. As usual, we have some catching up to do, right? The earliest Roman history that we've covered, and the other thing to remember, of course, right, is that we are in a period when our sources are reaching back into places that they don't know, they don't know much more about than we do, right? I mean, Livy is writing hundreds of years back. The earliest Roman to do a history of Rome seems to have been Q. Fabius Pictor, and that wasn't until around 200 BC. So we're really dealing with stuff that has legendary elements in it. Not all of it is exact, precise history in the way that we think of it now. But to that point, right, part of that means that it's got a kind of philosophical aspect as well. You're telling, essentially, you're picking and choosing stories, and you're telling myths as well as history in order to convey what you see as the development of your society. So we keep that in mind as we reach back, right, way back to Aeneas, whom we talked about. He arrives in Italy after having fled Troy. Troy is burned by the Achaeans, and he establishes power in Latium, in the town of Lavinium, which is named for Lavinia, who's the daughter of King Latinus of the Latins. And so this is where we get all of these words, right? Like Latin, for example, and Latinate. And he basically steals Lavinia out of the hands of Turnus, who's his great rival of the Rutuli, and he fights the Rutuli and wins in war. And so Livy shows some awareness of the fact, some very sophisticated awareness, it's fair to say, of the fact that when he's talking about some stuff this far back, he knows that there are stories being told, some of which are more impressive than they are credible, to paraphrase him. And it's important to keep in mind, right, that he and we are on the same page about this, right? He, like us, knows that he's relating to us the best information he has, plus the mythical embellishments that his people have handed down in order to understand where they come from. And so that's what we're dealing with. And the question on the table is basically, what are the rudiments of Rome's greatness? What are the basic elements out of which it was first built and then grew to become, what it now is? It's the same question really that Polybius was dealing with. We talked about Polybius, right? How did this happen? And so in some sense, we have a kind of artistic depiction going on side by side with an attempt at history, right? An artistic depiction of what Polybius was talking about, which is this development of the tripartite constitution and so forth. So now, the war between Aeneas and the Rutuli is given in Livy as the starting point for all subsequent hostilities between Rome and its surrounding cultures. And this is especially true of the Etruscans. And so after Aeneas basically establishes a foothold against the Rutuli and against the surrounding rivals, Aeneas dies. And so that's, here, I'll read the passage with that. The original settlers were no less loyal to their king Aeneas than were the Trojans themselves. Trojans and Latins were rapidly becoming one people, and this gave Aeneas confidence to make an active move against the Etruscans in spite of their great strength. Etruria, indeed, had at this time, both by sea and land, filled the whole length of Italy, from the Alps to the Sicilian Strait, with the noise of her name. Nonetheless, Aeneas refused to act on the defensive and marched out to meet the enemy. The Latins were victorious, and for Aeneas, the battle was the last of his labors in this world. He lies buried on the river Numicus. Was he man or god? However it be, men call him Jupiter Indiges, the local Jove. So this is this sense of storytelling to get at kind of why we think of ourselves the way we do, we being the Romans, right? And he's looking back at this time in which Aeneas basically establishes a foothold. He becomes divinized. And then his son, Ascanius, is his heir. And he's kind of under Lavinia, Aeneas' wife, until he comes of age, because he's still young. And Livy expresses some doubt about whether this was Ascanius, the actual biological child of Aeneas and Livia, or the other Ascanius who's in the Aeneid, and that would be the one from whom Augustus claimed lineage. And so this is important, right? Because Augustus traces his line all the way back to these founding figures. And Livy kind of, perhaps subversively, says, I don't don't know. It might have been that. It might also have just been this new child of Aeneas and Lavinia. But in any case, whichever Ascanius it is, when he comes of age, he sets forth and founds a new city because the old city is basically crowded, and he's about ready to make his name. And he founds what's called Alba Longa. It's this sort of long ridge in the Alban hills. And this becomes the setting for one of Livy's most famous myths. And this is where we're going to get our first king from, named Romulus. And so I'll read this kind of mythological material. And he's no dummy about how it works and whether or not it's true. So here's the whole story of the birth of Romulus and Remus. So Ascanius was succeeded by his son Silvius, meaning born in the woods. We get this long genealogy, which I will sort of skip over some of these stories, right? And eventually, what we get is Procca, the next king. This is still in Alba Longa, right? Had two sons, Numitor and Amulius, the elder of whom, Numitor, had left the hereditary realm of the Silvian family. That, at least, was his intention, but respect for seniority was flouted. The father's will ignored, and Amulius drove out his brother and seized the throne. One act of violence led to another. He proceeded to murder his brother's male children and made his niece, Rhea Silvia, a Vestal, ostensibly to do her honor, but actually by condemning her to perpetual virginity to preclude the possibility of issue. So this is clearly, again, it's clearly got mythological elements to it, but what we have is this younger brother who basically supplants the older brother and consigns Rhea Silvia to perpetual virginity by making her a Vestal virgin and consecrating her to the goddess. Now, Romulus and Remus are essentially either children of Mars or children of rape, and so this is where Livy shows that he's kind of aware of the complexity here. So he says, "But I must believe it was already written in the book of fate that this great city of ours should arise, and the first steps be taken to the founding of the mightiest empire the world has known, next to God's. The Vestal Virgin was raped and gave birth to twin boys. Mars, she declared, was their father. Perhaps she believed it. Perhaps she was merely hoping by the pretense to palliate her guilt. Whatever the truth of the matter, neither gods nor men could save her or her babes from the savage hands of the king. The mother was bound and flung into prison. The boys, by the king's order, were condemned to be drowned in the river. Destiny, however, intervened. The Tiber had overflowed its banks. Because of the flooded ground, it was impossible to get to the actual river, and the men entrusted to do the deed thought that the floodwater, sluggish though it was, would serve their purpose. Accordingly, they made shift to carry out the king's orders by leaving the infants on the edge of the first floodwater they came to, at the spot where now stands the ruminal fig tree, said to have once been known as the Fig Tree of Romulus. In those days, the country thereabouts was all wild and uncultivated, and the story goes that when the basket in which the infants had been exposed was left high and dry by the receding water, a she-wolf, coming down from the neighboring hills to quench her thirst, heard the children crying and made her way to where they were. She offered them her teats to suck and treated them with such gentleness that Faustulus, the king's herdsman, found her licking them with her tongue. Faustulus took them to his hut and gave them to his wife Laurentia to nurse. Some think that the origin of this fable was the fact that Laurentia was a common whore and was called Wolf by the shepherds. So this is great because, first of all, anybody that has ever read the Bible will probably recognize an extreme similarity here to the story of Moses, right, who is basically placed in a basket to save his life and picked up. It's kind of the reverse because he's picked up by the daughter of Pharaoh and becomes royalty, even though he's actually this kind of Jewish refugee. In this case, right, we have these guys that are being, they should be killed, but then basically the guys that carry it out are just sort of don't finish the job, and they end up in the mythological story, one of the most famous images from all of Roman history, right? They end up nursed by a she-wolf. And you can say a ton of stuff about these similarities between these myths, right? And we've talked about this before. We talked about Fraser, for example. The similarities between these myths, either it just means that there are certain psychological impulses in all of humanity, and that's where you stop, Or, as I believe, you say that there's actually this intuition, the storytelling intuition kind of leads us to certain core truths. One of which is that a son who enters into the world that is not his own will one day become king. And that the Jesus story is basically the myth that happened. So these are from, obviously, this story in Livy is from a far distant past. The Jesus story and the Moses story are basically, regarded by Christians as history. But the idea would essentially be that, these stories, the history and the myths, both kind of pattern out this reality that is finally crystallized in the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus. So that's just a note about the similarity of these myths. But note also that all of this skepticism that we have and this kind of curiosity about, well, can this really be true? All of that's there in this original text, right? Well, maybe it was a she-wolf or maybe it was a common whore. And that just sort of forthrightness about it is really admirable, I think, on Livy's part, and tells us again that, these questions have been active since these texts were written. So, okay, Romulus and Remus are raised by Faustulus the shepherd as shepherds. And it's clear, as it often is in these kinds of stories, it's clear that they're men of extraordinary character and nobility. They become these kind of Robin Hood guys. They rob from brigands and they give to their friends. They rob from outlaws and they kind of spread it around to their pals. And there's an indicator in this, I think, of what Livy views as the bedrock character of Rome. And this is the foundational kind of man who lives here in Rome. Who is it? Well, it's a rough and tumble bad boy, but concealed as a bandit is this kind of nobility and greatness, the seeds of greatness hidden within this bad boy. And there's something, I think, very recognizable for Americans in this. When we talked about the Maltese Falcon, I talked about our tradition of telling bad boy stories. This idea that the guy with a kind of a rough edge, who's a little bit mischievous and willing to push back against authority, is the guy that we admire, because we have this intuition in America, I think, that authority, again, going back to our problem with kings, we have this intuition that authority can be terribly mishandled. And now, for example, when coronavirus lockdowns are so strict, that's one of the things that I'm constantly advocating is, look, there exists a moral intuition in the heart of a spirited man that needs expression. Even if we believe that law is a good thing in general, there is also this kind of chaotic good, right? This rough and tumble guy that can kind of stand up and say, no, actually, even though all the powers that be around me tell me to go right, I'm going to go left, right? That's, I think, the story of Romulus and Remus tells us about, what that guy is to Rome in Livy's view. He's the heart of Roman virtue, and eventually now he's going to get refined into the true Roman. So Livy tells us that Numitor, who is the brother of Amulius, remember, right? Amulius is the one that's doing all of this bad stuff, is trying to get these kids killed and consigning Rhea Silvia to their mother to virginity and so forth. He's now wrongly on the throne, and he finds out that they are his grandsons. He catches on that these guys who've been kind of making trouble, he kind of gets wise. And there's this yearly festival, which is kind of raunchy and raucous. And during it, all the young men in the area are known to do kind of wild stuff and run around naked and everything. And during this time, the brigands that Romulus and Remus have been messing with, they try to get the twins in trouble. They accuse them of ravaging Numitor's lands, and Remus is captured. So the game is basically up, right? Remus was handed over. I'm reading now from Livy, right? The Remus was handed over for punishment to Numitor. Now Faustulus, remember, this is the shepherd who raised them, right? Faustulus had suspected all along that the boys he was bringing up were of royal blood. He knew that 2 infants had been exposed by the king's orders, and the rescue of his own 2 fitted perfectly in point of time. Hitherto, however, he had been unwilling to declare what he knew until either a suitable opportunity occurred or circumstances compelled him. Now the truth could no longer be concealed. So, in his alarm, he told Romulus the whole story. Numitor, too, when he had Remus in custody and was told that the brothers were twins, was set thinking about his grandsons, the young men's age and character, so different from the lowly born, right? So they do have this kind of natural quality of nobility, confirmed his suspicions. And further inquiries led him to the same conclusion until he was on the point of acknowledging Remus. The net was closing in, and Romulus acted. He was not strong enough for open hostilities, so he instructed a number of the herdsmen to meet at the king's house by different routes at a preordained time. This was done, and with the help of Remus at the head of another body of men, the king was surprised and killed. Before the first blows were struck, Numitor gave it out that an enemy had broken into the town and attacked the palace. He then drew off all the men of military age to garrison the inner fortress, and as soon as he saw Romulus and Remus, their purpose accomplished, coming to congratulate him, he summoned a meeting of the people and laid the facts before it. Amulius's crime against himself, the birth of his grandsons, and the circumstances attending it, how they were brought up and ultimately recognized, and finally, the murder of the king, for which he himself, that is Numitor, assumed responsibility. The two brothers marched through the crowd at the head of their men and saluted their grandfather as king, and by a shout of unanimous consent, his royal title was confirmed. So we have this originary moment of young men gathering behind these leaders to depose the unjust. So Romulus and Remus have set their grandpa rightly back on the throne, and they are seized by a desire to found a city on the spot where they were rescued and discovered. So paying tribute again to the humble beginning. You have to imagine, right? Livy is walking among this now, the city that is rapidly becoming marble, as I said at the beginning, right? That Augustus is turning this city from stone into marble, and it's become this almost unrecognizable thing. And he's pointing, he's like, here and here, this is the river that was named after this former king of Alba Longa. This is the spot where Aeneas stood, and this is where he was divinized. And this is this attempt to kind of reclaim and to identify the bedrock of what Rome is still there in these places and in these stories. And so he's doing that as a way of kind of reckoning with how Rome became what it is. This is Rome, right? It's not called that yet, but it will become Rome, this new city that they are founding, Romulus and Remus, in the place where they were rescued and discovered by the she-wolf, as the myth goes. The question becomes, who's going to rule? And that is, I want to dwell on this moment because even though Livy calls it disgraceful, it's a crucial element of kind of how Roman attitudes toward rulership begins. So Livy says, a disgraceful quarrel arose from a matter in itself trivial. As the brothers were twins and all question of seniority was thereby precluded, they determined to ask the tutelary gods of the countryside to declare by augury which of them should govern the new town once it was founded, and give his name to it. For this purpose, Romulus took the Palatine Hill and Remus the Aventine as their respective stations from which to observe the auspices. Remus, the story goes, was the first to receive a sign, 6 vultures, and no sooner was this made known to the people than double the number of birds appeared to Romulus. The followers of each promptly saluted their master as king, one side basing its claim upon priority, the other upon number. Angry words ensued and followed all too soon by blows. And in the course of the affray, Remus was killed. There is another story, a commoner one, according to which Remus, by way of jeering at his brother, jumped over the half-built walls of the new settlement, whereupon Romulus killed him in a fit of rage, adding the threat, so perish whoever else shall overleap my battlements. This is another, all of these stories are incredibly famous, but, there are Greek legends not unlike this one. There's another example of something that, we've seen myths similar to this. Oeneus and Toxeus, Poimander and Leucippus, these are names you may not have heard of, but they are basically have similar experiences. To me, the interesting thing here is that it establishes this inherent uncertainty about the divine right of kings, this idea that it's the gods who decide that kings should rule, and they are inherently better than other people, or they just as, divinely inspired, no matter what they do, that's what they are. They are kings. And this creates this different, on the one hand, they do consult the gods, and the gods do give these signs, but the signs themselves are ambiguous, which to me is like, the genius of mythology, this perfect symbol. The signs are ambiguous, and there's this element of kingly merit, right? That Romulus, and again, it's virtue in the Machiavellian sense of virtu, right? It's not necessarily something we admire. And again, Livy calls it disgraceful, but it's something that it takes to rule, especially in this moment when you have this small agrarian community up against these bigger societies like Etruria and so forth, right? This is a place where kingship is going to call for decisive physical action. And Romulus displays it. And so in some senses, the consultation of the gods leads also to a little meritocracy in miniature, right? And so from the beginning, Rome at least has this idea that it's not just any man, and it's not actually that there exist these men that are, inherently better than other people in the abstract. It's that these people should demonstrate their virtue and they prove themselves. And we're going to see in a second that this is not a hereditary monarchy. So that's borne out in their political procedures. And of course, Livy is thinking also of the Republic and of Rome's values after that. And so he's kind of peering back into these myths and finding in them Roman attitudes toward kingship that allow it to help this nascent community to thrive instead of to just be oppressed, basically. So Romulus proceeds to shore up his power in exactly these terms. Right? He fortifies the Palatine Hill, which is where he himself was brought up. He establishes religious rites and temples, and he moves on to laws. And here's comments that Livy makes about his legal procedure. Right. Meanwhile, Rome was growing. More and more ground was coming within the circuit of its walls. Indeed, the rapid expansion of the enclosed area was out of proportion to the actual population and evidently indicated an eye to the future. In antiquity, the founder of a new settlement, in order to increase its population, would, as a matter of course, shark up a lot of homeless and destitute folk and pretend that they were born of earth to be his progeny. This is a good example of Livy's just kind of like being a country guy. The translation here is reflecting, and by the way, we always recommend a translation. This is Aubrey de Sélincourt, the Penguin Classics edition. It's really nice. I do recommend it. So they shark up a lot of homeless and destitute folks and pretend that they were born of earth to be his progeny. Tom Holland talked about this, autochthony, right, when we had him on. Romulus now followed a similar course. To help fill his big new town, he threw open in the ground, now enclosed between two copses as you go up the Catiline Hill, a place of asylum for fugitives. Hither fled for refuge all the ragtag and bobtail from the neighboring peoples, some free, some slaves, and all of them wanting nothing but a fresh start. That mob was the first real addition to the city's strength, the first step to her future greatness. So this is the raw material of Roman greatness. And we are going to see, and we have actually seen already, all the ways in which that's not particularly pretty. It's not, delicate and civilized. But Livy is acknowledging here something that we've talked about a lot on this show that is true, is that, whether or not you build a virtuous city is up to you, but you can't build a city at all without these manly energies that can get a little bit unstable, that can get out of hand. And so you've got basically this military force now full of people who want, as Livy says, a fresh start. Great, but there's no girls, right? This is the problem. And obviously it's a problem, right? For one thing, you can't obviously reproduce, you can't perpetuate the city without women. Plus, they're schmucks, right? They're all these randos from everywhere who have committed crimes, and the surrounding people kind of fear and hate them, Livy says. There's this weird sense in which, who are these new upstarts? They're very dangerous. And so they send these envoys around to propose union and marriage with the women of various societies, but they don't get received anywhere. And so they devise another extremely famous undertaking, commonly referred to as the rape of the Sabine women. Great example of something, right? Not particularly comfortable, but this is how it happened, right? Romulus' overtures, Livy says, were nowhere favorably received. It was clear that everyone despised the new community and at the same time feared, both for themselves and for posterity, the growth of this new power in their midst. More often than not, his envoys were dismissed with the question of whether Rome had thrown open her doors to female as well as to male runaway and vagabonds, as that would evidently be the most suitable way for Romans to get wives. The young Romans naturally resented this jibe, and a clash seemed inevitable. Romulus, seeing it must come, set the scene for it with elaborate care. Deliberately hiding his resentment, he prepared to celebrate the Consualia, a solemn festival in honor of Neptune, patron of the horse, and set notice of his intention all over the neighboring countryside. The better to advertise it, his people lavished upon their preparations for the spectacle all the resources, such as they were in those days, at their command. On the appointed day, crowds flocked to Rome, partly no doubt out of sheer curiosity to see the new town. The majority were from the neighboring settlements of Caenina, Crastumnium, and Antemnae. But all the Sabines were there too, with their wives and children. Many houses offered hospitable entertainment To the visitors, they were invited to inspect the fortifications, lay out numerous buildings of the town, and express their surprise at the rapidity of its growth. Then the great moment came. The show began, and nobody had eyes or thoughts for anything else. This was the Romans' opportunity. At a given signal, all the able-bodied men burst through the crowd and seized the young women. Most of the girls were the prize of whoever got hold of them first, but a few conspicuously handsome ones had been previously marked down for leading senators, and these were brought to their houses by special gangs. There was one young woman of much greater beauty than the rest, and the story goes that she was seized by a party of men belonging to the household someone called Thalassius. In reply to the many questions about whose house they were taking her to, they, to prevent anyone else laying hands upon her, kept shouting, "Thalassius, Thalassius." This was the origin of the use of this word at weddings. So he's giving what's called an etiology and a story of the origins of these wedding traditions. Look, the rape of the Sabine women has a long, long history in artistic representation and in retellings and so forth. And it gets trotted out as this like funny thing, right? Like all these like doofus men having to capture all these women just so that they can perpetuate their society. But like that's a pretty vivid description. I think Livy means it to be, and to confront us with the troubling fact that Rome, had to do this, and this is part of its kind of rougher and more brutal beginnings. And of course, it leads to a war, right? What else is going to happen when you steal all of the women? Never mind the psychological harm to the women, right? You're going to get their fathers and even husbands, right? Their former husbands charging your city, right? And so this is exactly what happens. And remember that even though it's called the rape of the Sabine women, there are these other civilizations involved too: Caenina, Crastumnia, Mantemni. This is a big deal, and it's a bold move, right? It's a big risk for the survival of Rome. Various offensives and counteroffensives sort of ensue, and Rome wins them all, but then the Sabines come last, and that's part of why we think of this as a Sabine-Roman conflict, right? Is that via this sort of treachery, Spurius Tarpeius, who is the chief of the citadel, or the commander, let's say, of the citadel, right? His daughter kind of lets them in. They take the citadel. They advance on the Palatine. Romulus mounts a defense that's very successful, but things are very, very ugly. And there's serious possibility that Rome is going to lose, and definitely there's going to be a terrible loss of life. And then again, this famous moment. So this is hugely important. So I'm going to read this part too. So Metius Curtius had led the Sabine advance down the slope from the citadel. He had driven the Roman troops back in disorder over the ground, today occupied by the Forum, and nearly reached the gate of the Palatine. "Comrades," he cried, "we have beaten our treacherous hosts, our feeble foes. They know now that catching girls is a different matter from fighting against men." The boast had hardly left his lips when Romulus, with a handful of his best and most courageous troops, was on him. The fact that Metius was mounted proved a disadvantage to him. He turned and galloped off, the Romans in pursuit, and his bold stroke on the part of their leader inspired the Roman troops elsewhere on the field to make a fresh effort to rout their opponents. The battle goes on for some time, right? The battle was renewed in the valley between the two hills, and this time the Romans had the best of it. This was the moment, crucial, right? This was the moment when the Sabine women, the original cause of the quarrel, played their decisive part. The dreadful situation in which they found themselves banished their natural timidity and gave them courage to intervene. With loosened hair and rent garments, they braved the flying spears and thrust their way in a body between the embattled armies. They parted the angry combatants. They besought their fathers on one side, their husbands on the other, to spare themselves the curse of shedding kindred blood. "We are mothers now," they cried. "Our children are your sons, your grandsons. Do not put on them the stain of parricide. If the relationship between you is hateful to you, turn your anger against us. We are the cause of the strife. On our account, our husbands and fathers lie wounded or dead, and we would rather die ourselves than live on either widowed or orphaned." The effect of the appeal was immediate and profound. Silence fell, and not a man moved. A moment later, the rival captains stepped forward to conclude a peace. Indeed, they went further. The two states were united under a single government, with Rome as the seat of power. Now, this is again a centrally indicative moment in the early history of Rome. And what it shows you is these women playing a foundational role in civilizing Rome, which has basically up to this point been a band of brigands, right? And they've done all this kind of shady stuff. It begins with a murder. It goes on from there. And you can hear in the pathos of the women's speech, they're performing an act sort of self-sacrificial forgiveness, right? They're making peace in the way that we keep talking about now with all these racial recriminations. Like, yes, there have been terrible, racial crimes in the history of America, and in order to move forward, you need the people who do the forgiving to kind of to pay that cost of the forgiveness, and it's not fair, and it's not pretty, but it's the only way to live, right? Dare I say, it's a very Christ-like act on the part of the Sabine women to kind of take on themselves the sins and the back and forth that have been going on between these two societies, because otherwise they'll just destroy each other, right? The only other option, and this is part of the structure of the world. This is why the crucifixion is such an interesting and profound and powerful moment, right? Is that it's not about fairness; it's just about how the world is set up. That you either just go back and forth and fight forever, or somebody takes upon themselves this burden of making peace and offering forgiveness. And that's what the women do. And that you see now these kind of two elements of Rome, right? The civilizing force of women, the civilization building force of men. And it's all contained by and governed by Romulus, who is shown as this guy with, wisdom, prudence, statesmanship, but also a lot of that spirit of his own. So on some level, this is one of the most realistic depictions of primitive human gender dynamics that is to be found anywhere. And there follow, some struggles with the neighboring Etruscans, Fidenae and Veii. The neighbors of Rome keep getting alarmed by his success, but that basically we now are bringing the reign of Romulus to an end. And he was said to have been taken up into the air, and so there was no actual body buried. But archaeologists just in February, they found this place that might between the in the Forum, between the Palatine and Capitoline Hills, there's this place where they maybe commemorated his life. But in any case, he was also, you would call it apotheosized or divinized. There follows another telling moment. The senators, right? At this point, remember, these are pure noblemen. These are the aristocrats. They are arguing about who is going to be in charge. And the Sabines and the Romans have just joined together, but no one can decide who can rule because they're not sure whether it should be a Sabine or it should be a Roman, and they don't want to give too much power to one or another. And so here Rome says, Rome was without a ruler and her army without a commander, and the senators could not but see in this combination of circumstances a danger of attack. Some form of government there must be, this much was agreed, and neither party would yield. The 100 senators determined to exercise a joint control. They divided their number into 10 decuries, with one man from each as president, and these 10 performed the function of government, though only one carried its insignia and was intended by lictors. His period of power was limited to 5 days, and it passed to each senator in rotation. The monarchy was in abeyance for a year, and the period of its abeyance was known as the interregnum, which is a word we've heard before in other contexts, right? A term still in use now in Rome. And so again, you have this notion of self-determination, right? Of adjudicating reasonably political power disputes. The people actually are the ones who eventually want one king. And so the senators say you can vote for a king as long as we approve. And this is the birth of this sort of separation of powers idea. They end up picking Numa Pompilius, who is in the Sabine town of Cures. And he's noted as a good and virtuous man. And his role in this series of legends is to give Rome religion. Now, of course, Romulus had founded certain rites and he had established temples and so forth. But because there was no security, because they were constantly at war, he hadn't really had time for culture building. And so this is the flip side. So the kind of rough and tumble creation of the populace is the story of Romulus. The flip side of it is at peace, when there isn't war, Numa devotes his attention to the gods and to creating a functioning society. And again, Livy is quite open about this. There's deception involved. Numa tells a kind of story. And this is Polybius who says also that, the people need stories to enshrine for them the values that will keep them from tearing each other apart. And so here's Livy's account of sort of how Numa does this. It's what Plato would have called the noble lie, right? The story you tell to set peace. Rome was now at peace. There was no immediate prospect of attack from outside, and the tight rein of constant military discipline was relaxed. In these novel circumstances, there was an obvious danger of a general relaxation of the nation's moral fiber. So to prevent its occurrence, Numa decided upon a step which he felt would prove more effective than anything else with a mob as rough and ignorant as the Romans were in those days. This was to inspire them with the fear of the gods. Such a sentiment was unlikely to touch them, unless he first prepared them by inventing some sort of marvelous tale. He pretended, therefore, that he was in the habit of meeting the goddess Egeria by night, and that it was her authority which guided him in the establishment of such rites as were most acceptable to the gods, and in the appointment of priests to serve each particular duty. So, this is just a flat-out lie, right? It's an invention, says Livy. And yet, being as honest as he can, he tells us, this is how we kept ourselves from devolving morally while we didn't have war. Because as we talked about before on this show, right, war is a great inspirer of courage. It's a great inspiration for men, especially. And he basically creates all of these rites, Numa Pompilius does, to set people's hearts toward the good. And when you do that in a way that is sort of honest and represents, even if it's factually false, it represents nevertheless some moral truth that is being governed again by a virtuous person in charge. It's a very powerful thing. And so then he establishes the Temple of Janus. This is very important, the two-faced god of ends and beginnings. And when the doors of the temple were open, this was military campaigning. Rome was campaigning. When they were closed, all war was concluded. And Livy tells us they're closed 3 times. Once during Numa's reign, once after the first Punic War against Carthage in the 230s BC, and once, this is crucial, after the Battle of Actium in 31 BC. And that, of course, is what brings Augustus to power. So he's making this link between the kind of stately king of Roman religion and the era that Rome is currently in. And this is essentially Numa's role. He's the peacemaker, he's the culture maker. And you get now these 2 massive sides of this one Roman coin. The manly virtue that creates the city, that defends it against destruction, the sort of religious and cultural virtue that encourages people to build and to cultivate themselves, and as the flip of that coin, right, as the thing in between those 2 halves are the crucial, the Sabine women and the women of the society who are this civilizing influence upon the men. Now, let us pause to note a few things, right? Because this is basically concludes our description of the good kings of Rome. The character of the individual kings at this point is crucial to Rome's reign, right? And frankly, the character of individual leaders is always important. Thucydides tells us that under Pericles, Greece was a democracy kind of in name only, right? There's an extreme thing to say, but this idea that, a virtuous leader is indispensable even if you're electing him, right? You need something to guide the country, ideally. Now, of course, it's not the only thing, and it becomes the only thing under kingship, right? And so this is the dependence of monarchy on kingly virtue. Even though the people and the nobles, as you could see, have a role to play, right? This is its great strength and its great weakness. It's how Rome was able to be guided into the situation that it was, but it's not the situation that we're currently in, right? This is the key, is that we don't actually have virtuous leaders. What I have been arguing for some time, right, is that the founders basically saw the decay of kingship and the injustice of it, and they set up a situation in which the people were the ones upon whom the burden of virtue was placed. And that is still the case, right? We do have a sclerotic elite. If a king takes over, it's not going to be somebody that you or I like, even if he's your guy, right? It's going to turn out that you hate it. And we're going to talk more about that next week. But what that means is that it's on us to reclaim our republican virtue, to teach our children how to be courageous, to form institutions that teach them that, right? To recover religion, to go to church regularly, like these things. And I read at one point a letter from John Adams and describes this as the character of American republican virtue. There's a letter to the Abbé de Mably in 1783, right? And you can go back to that episode, or you can go and look it up. In my view, the seeds of our republican virtue are still there. And this is remarkable, right? Because all the Judith Butlers of the world, who's this, gender theorist, all the Klaus Schwabs, the Davos men that are inventing this ridiculous set of theories that have nothing to do with real life and are being drilled into the people through every major, institution, every big newspaper, every culture-making institution is plastering this, ridiculous 1619 project, America's evil nonsense all over the world, right? And yet, Latino men are flocking to the conservative movement, shockingly, right? The only people that the conservative movement lost out in the last election was white men, right? So this racialist narrative, this absurdist narrative is not working. And there is still, if you go out and you talk to people, you get off Twitter and you go, talk to the people in your gym, you talk to the people who are opening their restaurants against the lockdowns, you do whatever, you talk to these folks and you will find that, in point of fact, the American people still have good intuitions and can be harnessed if conservatives go out and make the case that the people are the ones who have to be seeing to the virtue of their own house, or else a king will do it for us, and we will not like that. All right. I hope that this has been a helpful start, and then next week we will conclude this discussion of kingship. Let's do the mailbag. Mailbag questions come to me on Twitter, although if you don't want to ask them to me on Twitter, then you should leave a 5-star review and ask your question in the review, as I said earlier. But here is another excellent question that I loved, and I want to pull it up so that I can get the person who sent it to me. This was Matt Miller, at MillsPhoto17. And he said, Spencer, if you were doing a Young Heretics podcast 300 years from now, is there anything from our time now you'd be talking about? Well, yes, there certainly is. The problem is that you can't write history in the present tense. And so this is always a very dangerous game to create the canon in advance. One of the things that is important about the canon is that time sifts out the stuff that doesn't make an impact. All of the stuff that's currently winning, all these Oscars, all these ridiculous movies, like, about like a gay, trans, Black teenager in the middle of nowhere, like these movies that, some of them good, some of them well made, but kind of small, kind of, about these minor concerns. I just don't think they'll last. I think that, they'll be enshrined in some kind of hall of wokeness, but they're not really where I'm looking. I am trying to find the people who are making art because they have to, because something in their heart compels them to, and so they're not, maybe they're not going to win the awards because, when you make art, you say uncomfortable things that, people like the Academy don't necessarily like. But, I'm looking, for example, at video games. I think I'll be talking about some video games like Ico. If you've ever played Ico, the art, the visual art and the narrative technique there, or Inside. I think I'll be talking about that. I think I will be looking at, some of the movies I've already talked actually about the movies that, but those are, I guess, somewhat older. So for modern stuff, it's video games. It's a few novelists. My dad is actually one of them, I have to confess. I'm biased, but, Andrew Klavan's novels, but also Michel Houellebecq's novels, this French novelist. So I'm looking for the people who are creating art who don't care what kind of plaudits they get, because our plaudit system is so wackadoodle. But those are a few things to start off with, and I'll come back to this question because I really like it. I like thinking about it, even though I think ultimately there's probably something out there that I've never even seen or heard of that I'm going to discover, or that people 300 years from now are going to discover. So thank you for that question. Thanks for listening. If you like this show, you will love the Claremont Institute, where I work. We publish the Claremont Review of Books, The American Mind. Go to claremont.org/donate, and you can help us out. We study the American ideals and how to perpetuate them and communicate them. And you can donate and let us know in the notes that you heard about it through Young Heretics, because that's always very pleasing to know. All right. Thank you so much for being with us. I will see you next week for more truth, beauty, and the stuff that matters.